Welcome to the SkullKing Fantasy Football Podcast, powered by StatRoute.com. And now, here's your host, Ryan Skullroot.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the SkullKing Fantasy Football Podcast. My name is Ryan Skullroot, and I am happy to be back. We want to apologize for missing this last week, not being able to put out a podcast. We had some family medical stuff we were taking care of, plus we had the holiday, and so we are now back going over the waiver wire tonight, going into the fantasy playoffs. Many of you who have a 3-week playoff are starting their playoffs this week in week 14. And we'll go over who you need to pick up. We'll go over a couple of stories, a couple of them that came up today about players for this next week that may be helpful to your fantasy teams. And so before we get started, I wanted to make sure to ask you to please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, whether you are listening on one of the multiple podcasting platforms we are on, whether it be Spotify or Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, whatever it happens to be. We would appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button. Please like this episode. We'd also appreciate if you'd give us a rating and a review. It helps us know what you like, what you don't like about the show, so we can make changes if we need to. And we would also really appreciate if you would share these episodes out, whether you're sharing the link on the link from our website at SkullKingFootball.com, or you're sharing it from your podcasting platform. So, again, we want to thank you all for listening to the podcast. Another couple things we want to go over real quick. Make sure to visit the guys. There we go. Visit the guys over at FinishFirstFantasy.com. They're one of our partners this year. FinishFirstFantasy.com is a basically an advice website, I guess you could say. But what they actually do is they actually have basically like advisors that bring you that message you once a week. You get 15-minute calls with them in order to make sure that you've got yourself all set up for your matchups. And coming into the fantasy playoffs, they could be an absolute huge help to you. They don't just do season long; they also do help with trades and such for dynasty leagues, as well as helping you with your DFS leagues. So please go to FinishFirstFantasy.com, check them out. Make sure to let them know that the guys from SkullKing Football sent you. One other thing is make sure also to check out Prolytics. That's PRO-LYTICS.com. They have been a huge lifesaver for many of us here on staff in terms of their projections for DFS lineups. While they mainly only cover, I want to say it's DraftKings and FanDuel for NFL, I have been able to use the information that they have with great success on Yahoo as well. So they have been absolutely fantastic. Love the information I've been getting from them. And so make sure to go to Prolytics.com, PRO-LYTICS.com, and you can actually use Prolytics basically all year, because I want to say that I believe they have NBA up, and they will, I think, have MLB up ready for the next year. So it's not just for football. You can use them for multiple sports. So make sure to hop on that and use them. You can, I believe, use the promo code SkullKingFF, all lowercase SkullKingFF, and that will get you 40% off your first month. All right, that is it for the advertisements and announcements. So why don't we go ahead and get right into the headlines.
Today's headlines.
All right, starting off the headlines tonight, we want to look at Mr. Dalvin Cook, who in the game tonight in Monday Night Football against the Seahawks actually sat out the second half after getting injured near the end of the first half. Took a shot to the chest and shoulder. He had been dealing with what they called a clavicle injury from the Denver game, and so he had been a bit sore from that, and actually ended up getting hit in the exact same spot tonight on a carry. So for that, they took him out and left him out of the second half as a precaution, and used Alexander Mattison. So definitely something to watch, something we will talk about later, and I'm sure is going to get put into one of the waiver wire articles by our great writers coming up tomorrow morning. Or if you're listening to this on the podcast, it would be this morning on SkullKingFootball.com. I'm pretty sure Alexander Mattison is mentioned as one of the guys that you should be picking up for the fantasy playoffs, especially if you have Dalvin Cook. So that's definitely something to watch for there. Story number 2, Minshew Mania is back. In the Jaguars game this last week, after they just were getting absolutely pummeled by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and unable to move the ball against a defense that can't stop anything except the run. Nick Foles was unable to get anything going, ends up getting benched, and so Gardner Minshew takes over the starting role and has been announced as the starter for the rest of the season. So Foles will be the backup for the rest of the season. Minshew does have a couple of possible decent games coming up to look at. Could provide some decent fantasy value, especially for DJ Chark owners and possible D.D. Westbrook owners. So definitely something to look for there. If you're in a super flex like I am, he may be someone to pick up for in that super flex spot. Possibly also should be owned in 2 quarterback leagues at this point. Number 3, it looks like John Ross will be active for Week 14, coming off of injured reserve. Finished the first 4 weeks. I want to say he was wide receiver 15 after 2 huge weeks in weeks 1 and 2. Kind of fizzled out in 3 and 4. I want to say 3 for 36 and 2 for 22 or something like that. In weeks 3 and 4. He is a possibility of someone to pick up. I think I listed him here later on as a player to pick up, but he is a guy that you'd want to possibly have for some depth on your fantasy rosters. If you weren't able to IR him and have him, sit on the IR spot all season. So he is a guy that I think could provide some value down the stretch if you need some depth at your wide receiver position or just an extra flex spot. So definitely a guy to look at. While I don't necessarily think he's going to bring back wide receiver 2 value right away, he could, after a couple games, maybe, second week of playoffs, week 15, week 16, those 2 weeks, he could provide some decent value there as you're getting into championships. So the one last thing I wanted to mention is that T.J. Hawkinson has officially been put on IR. He is done for the season. Had a bit of an up and down rookie year. Really, it was a quick up week 1, and then it was down all the rest of the season. It's basically the way it was. But he had been kind of battling some injuries and stuff. So hopefully he will be back next year, ready for a big season. All right, that is it for the headlines. Why don't we take a quick break, and then we will hop right into the waiver wire pickups for Week 14, week number 1 of the fantasy playoffs. Have your fantasy teams been struggling this year? Or perhaps you've been doing pretty well but want to put yourself over the top? Then make sure to visit our friends over at Finish First Fantasy Advisors. They are the premier one-on-one consulting firm that specializes in providing you with expert support to help guide you to the championship. You will be matched with one of their expert advisors to provide you with the season-long insight for your redraft, dynasty, or DFS formats. Their advisors will contact you weekly to answer all of your questions and provide you the needed information to get to the next level. Set up a free 15-minute consultation by emailing them at info@finishfirstfantasy.com or by visiting them at www.finishfirstfantasy.com. That's www.finishfirstfantasy.com. All right, we are back, so why don't we go ahead and hop right into the waiver wire madness.
Waiver Wire Madness.
All right, here we go with our Week 14 waiver wire picks. To start off with the QBs, there's really 2 QBs that I'm looking at for picking up on waivers this week. Number 1 is going to be Ryan Tannehill. Tannehill has played absolutely phenomenally over the last, over his last 6 games. 6 starts, 7 games. He played pretty well in his first one, week 6, when he came in for Marcus Mariota when he got benched. Since then, he has started 6 games. And before this week against Indianapolis, where he throws for 2 TDs, but I believe he also had a fumble, at least 1 fumble, if not 2. And only through he's got 13 points, 13.78 points. Before then, the previous 6 weeks, he only had 1 game under 19 points. And that was where he scored 18.94 points against Kansas City. So, really, I think that he is in for a very big week this week. He has a game against Oakland at Oakland. Oakland is giving up, the 5th most amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. And while he doesn't have the best wide receivers, they use a lot of the run game for the Titans in order to set up a little bit of passing. I think that Tannehill will be able to exploit the young defensive secondary for the Raiders and should be able to put up a decent amount of points, especially if you're dealing with injuries or whatever this week. I believe that Tannehill is definitely a solid pickup for this week, especially because of the matchup. So, only owned in 39% of Yahoo leagues. Number 2, the other one I'm going to pick may be a little bit, controversial. People may think I'm crazy, but the other one I want to go with is Ryan Fitzpatrick. And I know this is kind of nuts. He's owned in 10% of leagues, but he's going up against the New York Jets, who have played absolutely. Yes, they won 3 games in a row before coming in this last week, but that game was just, they've played some pretty awful teams and come up with some wins. And this last week, just getting romped by the Bengals was embarrassing. Ryan Fitzpatrick has been playing very, very well, throwing the ball a lot. Obviously, that's kind of live or die with him. But having Devontae Parker, who's been playing absolutely out of his mind this season, has been phenomenal for him. And the Jets are very middle of the road, right in the middle. I think 17th fewest points or 18th most, whatever it is, in terms of giving up fantasy points to the quarterback position. Ryan Fitzpatrick last week put up 27, the week before 25. He's had the 1 week of 12.9 points against Buffalo. But Buffalo is a very good defense, very, very tough. They're top 10 against quarterbacks. So I think this should open up some decent yardage, a couple touchdowns for Ryan Fitzpatrick this week against the Jets. He also has the New York Giants in Week 15, so definitely something to look at there. All right, moving on to the running backs, and the first running back I want to mention is Bo Scarborough. Been playing pretty decent since he took over the starting job for the Detroit Lions. It's not the best matchup this week, going up against Minnesota, who's given up the 5th fewest amount of fantasy points to the running back position. That being said, they got absolutely gashed tonight by the Seahawks. I want to say Chris Carson ran for over 100 yards, had a touchdown. Rashad Penny had a whole bunch of rush yards tonight, at least a whole bunch of total yards tonight, with a couple of touchdowns as well. So if the Detroit Lions can get anything going on the ground, he should provide some value. He's had 14, 18, and 21 carries over the last few weeks. Finished with 99 yards in Week 12. Last week against an okay defensive front in the Chicago Bears, he finished with 83 yards. And so going up against Minnesota, like I said, it's not the best pickup, but could provide some depth if you have to deal with injuries or whatever. The next guy I got on here, Alexander Mattison owned in 30% of leagues, and again, we talked about this earlier in the news and notes because of Dalvin Cook's injury. It's possible that he could sit next week, and so that would provide a lot of opportunity for Alexander Mattison going up against the Detroit Lions, who've given up the second most amount of fantasy points to the running back position. And so, again, Madison, who's owned in 30% of leagues. Let's not forget that, David Montgomery put up like 17 to 20 points this past week against that same Detroit defense. So Alexander Madison could be in for a very big game with a team that specializes and wants to run the ball. So next up is Raheem Mostert, owned in 14% of leagues. And the thing about Mostert is that he has a tough matchup next week against New Orleans. New Orleans has given up the fourth fewest amount of fantasy points to running backs. However, if you look at what Mostert has done over the last couple weeks, especially this last week against Baltimore, 19 carries, 146 yards, and a touchdown. He basically took over the backfield from Tevin Coleman, who finished with like 5 carries for 6 yards. Mostert has been an absolute beast. Let me put it up right here. For the 49ers running backs, this is a very interesting piece of news here. For 49ers running backs, rate of runs to gain for positive yardage, Mostert leads running backs, or leads the 49ers running backs with 88% of his runs going for positive yardage, compared to Coleman 76, Breida 76. Percentage of runs going for 5+ yards, Mostert 43%, Breida 34%, almost 35%, Coleman 25%. Going for 10 yards or more, Mostert 16%, compared to Breida 14, Coleman 9. Percent of runs going for a first down, Mostert almost 21% of his runs go for a first down. He has been the more consistent player, most consistent running back, and best running back, most explosive for the 49ers. So really, I think it would do them a lot of good if they just keep Mostert going, especially on this track. So he is definitely a guy to look at that could, again, if Breida is still out or something happens to Coleman, Mostert could provide a lot of value coming down the stretch as you're moving into the fantasy playoffs. He does have Atlanta and the Rams. So New Orleans in Week 14. He has Atlanta in Week 15, who hasn't been the best against the run, and the Rams, who've been back and forth on giving up yards, giving up points to the running back position. I think they've been about middle of the road. So one other running back to mention was, let me pull him up, Darwin Thompson. It's not the best matchup. He's going up against the New England Patriots, who've given up the fewest amount of fantasy points to the running back position. It is going to be in New England. The thing about this game is more the fact that Damian Williams and Darrell Williams may both be missing time. Darwin Thompson actually led the Kansas City Chiefs last week against Oakland in rushing attempts with 11. Finished 11 for 44 and a touchdown. So this would be more of an opportunity pickup than it is he is the guy. You've got to have him. So this is more an opportunity. If you want to let someone else pick him up because you don't want to deal with the uncertainty, I completely get it. He's only owned in 5% of leagues, so he very well may be widely available after that. So moving on to the wide receivers. At 32% owned, I can't believe he's still only 32% owned because I've talked about him multiple times, especially in my game previews. Cole Beasley going up against Baltimore, who's given up the 14th fewest fantasy points. So, again, right in the middle of the road. Cole Beasley over the last, over the last 7 weeks, since the bye week in week 6, he has put up, he has only had one game of less than 4 targets, only 2 games of less than 6 over the last 7 weeks. He also has 5 touchdowns over that time. has been. I mean, other than John Brown, really John Brown and Cole Beasley have been the two main targets for him, and Cole Beasley has done a lot with the work. So, running a lot of those short routes. This is a guy that could be a sneaky flex play in any of your fantasy leagues going to the playoffs. He has Pittsburgh in Week 15 now. Not a great matchup against New England in Championship Week, but for this week against Baltimore, I think this could be a very solid week for him. Again, not necessarily blow him out of the water, but a very good week for Cole Beasley. Again, only owned in 32% of leagues. Number 2, A.J. Brown owned in 25% of leagues. Again, going against Oakland, giving up the 9th most amount of fantasy points to wide receivers. A.J. Brown has moved ahead of Corey Davis in terms of being the number 1 wide receiver option for Ryan Tannehill. Again, it's been a bit inconsistent simply because they're a team that mainly relies on the run. That being said, A.J. Brown, if there's going to be a breakout wide receiver from that game, it's going to be A.J. Brown is the more likely target to go after. Number 3 is Russell Gage, owned in 11% of leagues. Not a household name, but he is the number 3 wide receiver for the Atlanta Falcons. Since Austin Hooper went out, if you don't count the week that Austin Hooper went out, Week 11 against Carolina, that week Russell Gage went 2 catches on 4 targets for 32 yards. Since then, over the last couple weeks, mind you, one of those games, Julio Jones was out with a shoulder injury. Russell Gage has had 19 targets over 2 weeks for 14 catches, 128 yards, and a touchdown. This is a guy that's getting targets, which, especially in PPR leagues, targets are what you're aiming for. The more targets someone gets, the more likely they're going to get receptions, which is more points there, which leads to yards and touchdowns. So Russell Gage is definitely a deep sleeper that I think could provide some decent value for you against a Carolina team that gives up the 8th most amount of fantasy points to wide receivers. So if Julio Jones misses again, they want to kind of hold him out. Kind of a lost season for the Falcons. They may want to see what Russell Gage has. This could be a good game for him. Another one, 7%. John Ross is another guy I talked about going up against Cleveland, who's given up the 10th fewest amount of points to wide receivers. Only 7% owned. This is more of a stash kind of for the for the fantasy playoffs. Let me pull up his schedule for the fantasy playoffs. He's got Cleveland Week 14, New England Week 15, Miami in Championship Week. So he's got a decent playoff matchup there. So maybe just a guy to hold as a depth piece just in case. Finally, the last one is Alan Lazard. He's more of a lottery pick, going up against the Washington Redskins defense. Again, middle of the road, 16th most points against the wide receiver position. Has only had 5 targets over the last 2 weeks. So since their bye week in Week 11. However, before that, had 5 straight weeks of at least 4 targets. So it could just be these last couple weeks just haven't worked all that well. He was playing against San Francisco in Week 12, which is always a tough matchup for wide receivers. Last week was against the New York Giants. There's 3 targets, 3 catches, 103 yards and a touchdown. So against the Washington defense that has struggled against wide receivers, this could be a good, solid, deep flex play for you. All right, last but not least, let's hit up these tight ends. And really, I think I've only got a few tight end options for you. Number 1 is Vance McDonald going up against Arizona. Arizona's given up the most fantasy points to the tight end position. Last week, they gave up, I want to say, to Tyler Higbee, the most. I want to say Tyler Higbee was the highest scoring tight end in fantasy last week. A couple weeks ago, to Ross Dwelley, the backup tight end for the San Francisco 49ers, they gave up a touchdown, almost gave up 2 touchdowns to him. It's been horrible for Arizona trying to guard tight ends. So Vance McDonald should be a huge pickup, owning 50% of leagues, should be in for a big week. Devlin Hodges should be targeting him early and often. I think he should be a great pickup, especially in your DFS lineups for this next week. Number 2, Jason Witten, going up against Chicago. Again, 50% owned. Chicago gives up the 7th most amount of fantasy points, so that's another team that very exploitable there. The last one, I hate to say this, but whether it's Gerald Everett or Tyler Higbee going against Seattle in the Sunday night football game, Seattle does give up the 4th most amount of fantasy points to the tight end position. And that was kind of obvious tonight after giving up a touchdown to Kyle Rudolph again tonight. So an exploitable matchup for tight ends. So we'll see if Gerald Everett misses the time. Tyler Higbee should be in for a decent week if Gerald Everett misses the time. So it's one or the other there. Both of them are widely owned. I want to say in 30%, or only own about 30% of leagues or less. So, all right, that is it for this waiver wire episode. I want to thank you guys for taking the time to listen. We will be back later this week for our game previews and get you ready for your fantasy playoff matchups. Again, my name is Ryan Skullrud. You've been listening to the SkullKing Fantasy Football Podcast, and we'll talk to you later. Hey, SkullKing Nation. Thank you for listening to the SkullKing Football Podcast. Did you like this episode? If so, be sure to go to iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and YouTube to subscribe. Also, please leave us a rating and reviews to let us know how we can better help you rule your leagues.